Hi, everyone. Greetings and welcome back to our January team training for teams who are in their second year of the PBIS Academy. I'm Christine Downs.
And I'm Eric Mackey.
And we're trainers for any PBIS. Today's content and agenda will focus on understanding equity. And we'll be examining a document called 5-Point Intervention to Enhance Equity in School Discipline. And as we dive into the topic of equity, please know there are lots of helpful readings and resources focused on the topic that can be found at any PBIS. And you can see lots of these resources listed here. We'll be using some of them and some of the content from some of them today during our training and during our training next month. As I said, our focus today is all about equity and disproportionality as they apply to schools. So especially in our current political and social context, talking about equity can be really hard and it can bring up strong emotion, including with us as trainers. These discussions can highlight systematic inequities in our educational system with regards to race, gender, sexual orientation, and physical ability, amongst others. We want to make sure that this is a safe space to have these discussions. So the norms that we are suggesting for these discussions are to ask questions throughout, speak your truth as it applies to you, make no assumptions but good intentions on the part of others when they're expressing their opinions, and get comfortable with discomfort, because we all have to get through these conversations. They're very important. So let's get ourselves focused by starting with some cartoons. And you've probably seen either one or both of these before. So we'll look at the top one and it says with the animals all lined up, all sorts of different kinds of animals. For a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please go climb that tree. Right? I want you to think about the experiences of your students in school. How might their experiences figuratively match this? Right? Are we assessing students in one way, or do we allow multiple ways of assessing students' knowledge and grasps of the concepts we're teaching them? Right? If you do find some parallels, take a moment to jot down how those experiences may match and who is predominantly effective. Which students are being asked to climb the tree that are in a fishbowl or are too big to do that, but clearly can still know the content. Look at the second cartoon, right? This might be familiar to you. You see the difference between equality, where everybody gets a box, and equity, where those who need some special accommodations get what they need. So the one boy gets one box, the other boy gets two boxes, and the gentleman doesn't get anything because he doesn't need it. That's an important difference. And teachers need to explain to both students and families that equity in school is about giving all students what they need. Some schools will go further, and you might want to consider further about the reality of the opportunities our students might come to school with, right? Some students have lots of opportunities before they ever even get to kindergarten. More reading, more access to preschool, maybe better sleep, better nutrition, right? Some students, we have a lot of typical average, and then we have some who are really starting out way behind others for all the reasons I suggested, that the first student has opportunities, the third student might be lacking in those. So thinking about how can we really start students on an equal basis and then provide equity with what they need. And of course, is there a way we can break down that fence in general? Can we take away those blocks to education and really liberate our students? So take some time, think about these cartoons, think about which students might match the experiences of these cartoons in your school. And what in your school, what would that fence represent in your school? And how could you remove that? Now, That might be barring equity for some of your students. There are a lot of realms where we can find disparities within the school context, such as academic achievement, placement in special education, or in gifted and talented programs, and certainly in school discipline. If you were going to break down the data by student, race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, IEP, or 504 status, do you think the groups would be representative? Or might they be skewed in their academic achievement or placement in special ed? Right? Which kids might have the highest discipline rates? My guess is that you've likely been able to identify some inequities right off the top of your head. So what could an equitable education system look like? Right? Consider this. We could have an equitable education system for all students, regardless of their characteristics, race, gender, ethnicity, and so on, if our policies, interactions, and resources are developed in such a way that they represent everyone, developed by everyone, and work for everyone, for all students, right? All students in this scenario have full access to high quality learning experiences through which they're able to meaningfully engage in and make progress. We want them all to reach that finish line. Right? Those learning experiences are developed in such a way that it empowers students to choose their own path. And so that disparities in the outcomes, like suspensions and graduation rates, are reduced. Right? How does this statement resonate with you? Think about what really is equity in education. So you've probably noticed a shift in how we've talked about the guiding principles of PBIS, the system, data, and outcome, and now equity. It's a purposeful shift to bring something that may have been presumed or it may have been masked to the forefront. We want to bring equity right up front, even though it's difficult, right? PBIS is for all students and all students should benefit from it. It's equally important for you, your team, and your school to think, is equity important to you, your team, and your school? And if so, why is it important? Right? What particular equity issues or gaps are you trying to address? So not only should we be focused on the equity of outcomes for students, but we should be embedding equity into our inputs, what we're putting into PBIS. Right? So practices, right? Can all teachers and students access them and benefit from them? For example, do all your students have access to the acknowledgement system, and are they getting it in an equal fashion, or only some populations? Can all students read your signs because they're in multiple languages, or is it only in one language? Our data, are we gathering data that helps us identify any inequities that can help us to identify whether we're implementing our practices equitably or inequitably? So are we looking at who's getting those referrals, right? Who's getting the positive acknowledgements? Are all kids getting them in an equal way? And then our systems. Have we set up our systems so they work for everyone, or do they just work for a few? So for example, are all faculty, including your paras, your administrative support staff, your substitute teachers, are all of them given true access to professional development around PBIS, or are they left out? And then our outcomes. Are we identifying outcomes that are meaningful to our community, right? And do our outcomes seem equitable? Like beyond just looking at graduation rates and academic growth, are you considering the school climate? Does school feel safe for everybody? How about staff turnover and out of district placement? Who's getting placed out of district, right? Can we break that data down? Can we disaggregate it to see what's going on? These are the guiding principles, right? We focus on system, data, practices, and our outcomes. And we want them to apply, and they keep us honest in our work, right? We want to make sure we're equitable to everyone. We are in a period of amazing political and social tension, and inequities are on the front page of our papers and magazines and social media and news daily, right? This tension has bubbled up to the top of our society, and it can be scary, right? But it does create an opening for change at the school, town, state, and national levels, if we're brave enough to have those conversations. So when looking at disproportionality, we need to become pretty well versed in understanding our own culture and the culture of the students with whom we work, and how our particular learning histories can create implicit and explicit biases. Right? We can look at culture as being part of a group of individuals that can change over time, right? And these groups have their own overt behaviors, their own verbal behaviors, like maybe a particular regional accent. Right? For those of you from Boston or the North Shore, right? You say like, park the car, right? And go to the bubbler. Did I have that right, Eric? Did I do that accent?
It's close enough. We'll take it.
Okay. Because I can hear it. I mean, I can't say it. Yeah. But that's sort of a shared learning history, right? Also think about growing up and going to the same schools. That's a cultural, that's a history, right? Going through the same curriculum, experiencing the same local and even our same world events like 9/11, experiencing that together. Experiencing common activities like going to the beach or the weekend skiing, right? So those are different kinds of cultural groups we might belong to. And these experiences and behaviors can differentiate one group from other groups, or sometimes they even overlap with other groups. So think of like the common experiences of students who broadly grew up in Massachusetts versus maybe some more nuanced experience of those of you who are on the North Shore, the South Shore, or out in Western Mass. Things look a little bit different. Right? And these experiences and behavioral patterns can help to predict an individual's future behavior, like how maybe they celebrate their holidays, what they eat, what values they hold. We're part of lots of different cultural groups. Right? We belong to some smaller groups like our families or our schools, but we also belong to lots of larger groups like our national organizations, maybe a political party, our religious institutions, our country, right? And the values and traditions and norms that shape our experiences aren't always aligned amongst all the different groups we belong, right? And it's part of what makes each person unique. But we often classify people for how they look or how they sound, presuming that the individual in front of us is part of only one group, sort of the biggest behavioral stereotyped group, right? And that they're going to behave in those stereotyped ways. We've been told about that, how that group might behave, right? And unfortunately, these stereotypes come naturally based on our learning histories, right? They're cognitive shortcuts that our brain takes. And they're often automatic and subconscious, but they also can depersonalize and dehumanize the person in front of us and skew our behaviors towards those people. If we presume that Black students are more aggressive, we might be quicker to respond to any hint of aggression from a student who presents to us as Black. If we presume that Asian students are smarter, we may academically overburden some of our students who we perceive to be of Asian descent. Okay? So again, these biases can be automatic, but they impact how we as adults behave. So until we examine our biases, we really can't address them, right? So in a moment, we're going to ask you to create your own personal learning history. You're going to put your critical life events and experiences that have shaped you around the outer circle. And then in the inner circles, you will add your personal identity roles or descriptors. What makes you you? right? Think about how you describe yourself to others and what's most important for you to be seen as. So here's the slide that you're going to download. And yes, it looks a little bit messy, but that's okay. You can see that I've added some of my life events here in the blue squares on the outside. Things like I've moved a lot when I was growing up, and even as a young adult, I moved around. You can see the experiences in the center, how I identify myself. Homeowner is a big one because as an adult, I bought a home and I've owned it for 20 years. So maybe all that moving around kind of led that to one of my characteristics. Or the fact that I have a cousin with Down syndrome and I was a babysitter and a camp counselor and I went into psychology and education, right, led me to be working with high needs students and eventually into PBIS. And that's another way I identify myself. So you're going to go through and do this same activity with your critical learning events and how you describe yourself. You're going to be able to watch a video to remind you of how this works. And you'll be able to download and complete that PowerPoint slide with all of your learning history in it. The video and the activity can be found on our NEPBIS syllabus for year 2. And you can pause this video now and you guys can start as a team or as individuals, start to complete the activity, or you can save it for later. But we do ask that you complete it and bring it with you to our February session. So disproportionality. All right. So through PBIS, we want to be able to see with data, right, whether we're truly being equitable, right? The opposite of equity or being equitable is disproportionality. And what disproportionality means is when a particular group, their representation in a particular category exceeds the expectation for that group or differs substantially from the representation of others in that category. Okay, what does that mean? Let me break that down. So let's say we have a population of 100 students and 50 of them are male and 50 of them are females, right? Their categories are male and female in this example, right? So we would expect that if 10% of the population, the 100% population, would be referred to special education services, that it should be 50% female and 50% male, right? So probably 5 and 5. But if we end up seeing something like we see here, where 80% of the referrals to special ed are male and 20% are female, then it's disproportionate, right? To see this difference, we need to really be able to break down our data. And some ways we really want to break it down are certainly gender, certainly race, IEP status, maybe 504, or English language learner status. There might be many different ones that are relevant to your school. So as an aside, it's really important to note, because some of you might be saying, oh, yes, but boys. No, there's no evidence that supports that boys are more likely to need special education services than girls. Research does not bear that out. So here's another example. Let's take a look at this data. This is from Mass Education Equity Partnership, and it highlights that despite Massachusetts leading in education by many metrics, there are still some strong disparities present for low-income students and students of color. So this top graph is about the out-of-school suspension rates for 2017. And you might notice that our percentage of Black students and students with disabilities who were suspended in Massachusetts was double the average of students across the state. Right? So there's some very significant disparities. In the bottom graph, it's the percent of high school graduates who's actually completing the Mass Core program in 2017. So you can see that white students were better than average, 86%, than the statewide average of 81%, right? All the other groups are below average, especially Black and English language learners. So looking at these two graphs, if you're Black, you're much more likely to be suspended and you're much less likely to graduate. So sadly, in Massachusetts, Black, Latinx, and low-income students are more likely to experience lower achievement rates, more reactive and exclusionary discipline consequences, and higher dropout rates. So despite being really good at a lot of things educationally in Massachusetts, there's still a long way to go towards full equity. And remember that this data is also a little bit more about the adult behavior than the student behavior. It's about how we're reacting to their behavior, right? Adults assign the consequences like suspensions. Adults assign classes, right? High achieving classes or AP classes, right? And adults teach the classes. So it's adult behavior we also need to work on. So some might say that disproportionality in outcomes can be explained by poverty level or socioeconomic status, right? So, but this research from 2014 comparing the odds that a student who is Black or receiving, one group is Black and the other group is receiving free and reduced lunch, they'll receive, right, here's the data on whether they're going to receive an office referral, suspension, arrest, or expulsion. Right, in comparison to the other group. And this graph indicates that both Black students and students receiving free and reduced lunch are twice as likely as any other student to receive an office discipline referral, right? They're both twice as likely, but Black students are much more likely to be suspended, to be arrested, or be expelled from school. So we really can't attribute disproportionality just on poverty level, because clearly that's not the case. Another common question is whether Black males are just more defiant, disruptive, or aggressive. And the research does not support this idea either. Again, it might be our response to student behavior, right? And this stereotype has more to do with policies, beliefs, and the behaviors of adults. I was just saying, our response. So given our focus on equity, it's reasonable to ask whether PBIS has an impact on disproportionality at all in school discipline, right? Doesn't PBIS help, right? And in this graph from Kent McIntosh's work on the impact of PBIS on racial and ethnic disproportionality, you can see that there is a percentage of students, the percentage of students suspended who are African-American or Black definitely went down, right, in schools that are implementing school-wide PBIS. But that's not enough. There's still a significant disproportionality here that needs to be addressed. So we have work to do in leveraging our framework, thinking about our culture and what's going on in our buildings and our communities to create equity. We're suggesting that while you build your PBIS framework, you hold that cultural lens up to make sure that we're addressing the needs of our community. We have some tools to help you through that process as we go. Okay, so take a moment. You're going to pause the video and consider how you will address the concepts of equity and disproportionality with your staff. So first, just consider whether you feel that you have enough fluency in these concepts to share with others in your school. Or do you need to do more research and more learning and more practice, right? Is your team itself culturally represented, right? Do you need to bring in other viewpoints to help with the equity conversation? Right? Self-examine your team. Examine your comfort level in having these discussions and presenting about equity and disproportionality. To be honest, these are really uncomfortable topics, and rightly so, but they're necessary to discuss. So despite your potential discomfort, you can move forward with these conversations. Can you move forward with these conversations, or do you need some support? Is there someone else in the building or another group that addresses equity issues that you can connect with? So bring these thoughts to your teams. Consider what your team wants to add to its action plan as a goal towards equity.
Now we're going to take this conversation a step further and talk about how we might go about creating better equity in our schools. We're going to talk about a 5-point approach for enhancing equity specific to discipline in our schools. Please note that the content and additional resources on this topic can be found at pbis.org under the topic of equity. We're going to be going over these in specific, but the 5 points include using engaging instruction to reduce the opportunity gap, implementing school-wide PBIS as a part of a preventative, multi-tiered, culturally responsive behavioral framework, collecting, using, and reporting disaggregated student discipline data, developing policies with accountability for disciplinary equity, and teaching strategies for neutralizing implicit bias in discipline decisions. Step 1 is to focus on effective academic instruction. We want to make sure that we are providing students with the most evidence-based curricula in the most engaging ways, be it for academic or social emotional skills. Without good content and teaching, students are likely to fall behind. Those who fall behind are then more likely to act out as they aren't able to follow along and relate to the content. So how do we address this as PBIS teams? Well, we work with our administration and academic coaches to ensure that teachers are trained in how to provide explicit instruction, high rates of opportunities to respond to the curriculum, and high rates of engagement, feedback to students that they can use to master their new skills, and use of data to assess which students are and aren't responding to the curriculum so that adjustments can be made as needed. So take a moment to think about which particular students or student groups seem to be missing opportunities to engage with the curriculum. This graphic shows data from the, I hope I'm going to say the name of the school correctly, the Teagard-Tualatin School District. You'll notice that in the 2007-2008 school year, there was a 43% achievement gap between the white students in blue and the Latino students in green, with regards to the percentage of population meeting or exceeding academic standards. They implemented an integrated multi-tiered system of support in behavior and academics to address this gap. You can see that the gap in academic outcomes between the white students and Latino students decreased significantly on their statewide assessment of content mastery. After implementation with Fidelity, that gap was reduced to 11%. This graph shows that the use of explicit instruction in multi-tiered systems of support can help close achievement gaps. So take a moment to pause the video and consider these questions. Do you and your team know how effective instruction is in your school? And how are you measuring effectiveness? And how can or do you support your staff in providing effective instruction? If you're looking for some guidelines for effective instruction, be sure to check out the Supporting and Responding to Behavior and the Examples of Engaging Instruction to Increase Equity in Education document on pbis.org. Discuss your responses with your team and add to your action plan as appropriate. The next step in the 5-point plan is to use school-wide PBIS as part of your school's preventative, multi-tiered framework. We can use the same data-based decision-making processes to identify disproportionality in discipline. I think we got to pause it. Sorry about that. All right, the next point to increasing equity within schools is to implement a multi-tiered behavioral framework, such as PBIS. Schools run the risk of perpetuating the biases of our broader society unless we put efforts towards creating a buffer against it. Implementing PBIS's core features to Fidelity works to promote equity within your school, especially when you consistently integrate the needs, strengths, and values of your school community into your PBIS efforts. Research has provided us with some specific PBIS practices that act as predictors of decreased discipline disproportionality. These include reviewing and sharing data on a regular basis to make decisions with regards to interventions and supports, disaggregating data, so breaking your data down by race, by IEP, by gender, etc., to identify any disproportionality, implementing PBIS within the classroom to fidelity, especially classroom preventative systems, and the use of formal reward systems while ensuring that all students have access to those acknowledgements. The third step focuses in on the collection, use, and disaggregation of data. Here is an example of one of the risk indices that can be generated in Swiss. This is called the referral risk ratio. This indicates that compared to white students, Black students are 2.2 times more likely within the school to receive an office discipline referral. Consider the data that you are currently using, or rather the data systems that you are currently using to store your behavioral referral data. Does your system create tables like this? Could it? If not, your team may want to speak with your local IT guru to find out if it will be possible to create such charts. If not, this might be a good time to consider something along the lines of Swiss. Let's take a moment here to think about other forms of outcome data that would be important to consider when we think of equity. Office discipline referrals are only one data source, and they focus on externalizing behaviors, those undesirable behaviors that we can very easily see and hear. What else could we attend to? What else is important to us? Some other types of data to consider might include attendance, school climate questions, suspensions, acknowledgements, nurse visits, guidance visits, social work visits, and referrals, etc. Your team will want to determine which outcomes are most important and relevant to your particular school culture. Then figure out whether A, you can gather data relative to that outcome, and B, whether you can disaggregate, so again, breaking down that data to be able to identify any inequities. So when you're next together with your team, consider these prompts and questions. So identify questions that you want to answer with your data. Those questions might include, are students showing up? Or are they engaging in the instruction? Then identify what data is important for answering those questions. Once you've identified what data you need, then figure out whether you can break it down and disaggregate it by race, gender, IEP status, language learner status, so forth. Also consider who has the time, capacity, and skill to do the analysis and prepare a summary for the team. How often could such a review happen? And after the team has reviewed the data, how might you be able to share that information with your broader staff? The fourth step in the 5-point intervention is to develop policies with accountability. Think about what you know about policies in your district with regards to equity and discipline. Not sure what policies are in place as a district? Whoa, just a moment, sorry about that. So if you're not sure about what policies are in place, this would be a good time to do that research. See if such policies exist for your school and or your district. If they exist, does anybody know about them? If not, they're not effective. If they exist, do they inform how you do your practice? Is that practice aligned with how your school actually functions? If not, the policy is not effective. If those policies exist, is there some form of accountability? Meaning, are there systems and structures in place to ensure that the policy is followed through upon? Just as we check the fidelity of our PBIS efforts using the TFI, there should be some sort of systems established to ensure that equity practices are being employed to fidelity. If you find that your school and district policies are lacking, this may be a good time for your team to advocate for stronger policies on the behalf of your students and for your staff. Here are some recommendations when it comes to developing policies relative to equity. Make sure that the policy is clear in its purpose and mission for equity. Consider embedding equity into hiring practices. How might the workforce reflect the diversity of the population that you're serving? Can you prioritize the hiring of individuals who understand and promote educational equity? Clearly identify practices for enhancing equity, such as proactive approaches to discipline and using instructional practices instead of exclusionary ones. And embed accountability into policy, including the development of teams to focus on equity, the sharing of disaggregated data on a regular basis to highlight any disparities, and building equity outcomes into administrator and teacher evaluations. Step 5 is to teach strategies to address the implicit biases that we all hold, that Christine was just talking about a little bit ago. We'll talk about this more next month. When you're with your team, take time to review the TFI Cultural Responsiveness Companion and focus on Section 2. You can find this document in the syllabus on nepbis.org or at pbis.org. As a team, identify 1 to 3 things that your school has been doing well to support equity. Also identify 1 to 3 practices that your school needs to stop doing at this point, as it may actually be contributing to inequity. And finally, identify 1 to 3 things that your school needs to change in order to support equity. So to review, today we talked about understanding what equity and disproportionality is. And we also provided and talked about a 5-point intervention for enhancing equity within schools focused on school discipline. So remember that your homework is to go through the Understanding Our Learning Histories. This should only take you about 25 minutes. Coaches, you may want to provide some friendly prompts between now and then to make sure that the homework gets completed. We'll discuss your experiences in February at our next meetings. You can find the video and activity linked to the slides for this session and on the syllabus page on nepbis.org. For additional readings and resources on the topics of equity and disproportionality as they relate to PBIS, please go to the center on PBIS at pbis.org. You can also find the Tiered Fidelity Inventory and the Cultural Responsiveness Field Guide at pbis.org. And you can find the Cultural Learning History activity on nepbis.org. So thank you so much for taking the time to review this video. We'll look forward to seeing you in February. Take care.
Bye-bye, everyone.